I never told my son about my $40,000 monthly salary. He always saw me as just a simple, ordinary Mother Summonie who left early for work, came home tired, cooked dinner, and retreated quietly to my own space. He had no idea of the life I led outside those walls, the contracts I signed, the decisions I made that affected hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. So when Marcus invited me to dinner with Lena's parents, I decided to step into a role I had never needed before. The humble, slightly naive mother, living paycheck to paycheck. I wanted to see how they would treat someone they thought was unremarkable. I wanted to witness their judgments firsthand, unfiltered, because truth often reveals itself in the quietest of ways. The restaurant door loomed ahead, polished glass reflecting the late evening lights. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. I could feel the rhythm of my own heartbeat, slow and deliberate, a quiet echo of years of choices made silently, carefully. I paused for a breath. In that pause was a lifetime of secrets, a dignity carried quietly through decades. I adjusted my coat, smoothed my hair, and stepped inside. The room smelled faintly, of roasted garlic and fresh bread. Warm light spilled over linen-covered tables, candles flickering softly. There they were, Lena's parents, Ethan with his perfectly trimmed hair and precise smile, and Vivian, her posture perfect, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk. I recognized immediately that my presence was being measured, weighed, judged. I let a gentle smile cross my face, the kind that hides everything beneath a calm surface. Lena appeared moments later, graceful, confident, and polite, but her eyes carried the same unspoken calculation I had seen in her parents. Marcus waved me over with that familiar warmth, that comfort of his presence that always made me feel like I belonged no matter where I was. Yet, here, in this room, I was both invisible and hypervisible, an outsider in plain sight. I slid into the chair beside Marcus, and the conversation began light, casual, polite, and yet I could sense the undercurrent. Subtle glances, carefully chosen words, the quiet testing of my reactions. Each compliment, each question, was layered with something more, and I listened, smiling softly, sipping water, letting them set the pace, never revealing the truth lurking just beneath the surface. Because that night, every gesture, every word, every glance would tell me more than they intended. And by the time the evening ended, I knew that the quiet power I carried, hidden for so long, would not stay hidden much longer. But at that very moment, stepping through the doorway, I was just Margaret, the simple mother Marcus believed I was, and that I realized was my most potent weapon. As we settled at the table, I noticed the little things immediately, the way Vivian Harper's eyes swept over me, not missing a crease in my coat or a strand of hair slightly out of place. Ethan's smile was practiced, polite, but there was something in the stiffness of his posture, a subtle assessment in his gaze. I could feel the quiet judgment floating in the air like a scent you can't quite ignore. Lena, ever graceful, guided me through the menu with gentle questions. "Do you like seafood?" she asked, a tilt in her voice that suggested she assumed I didn't. Marcus, oblivious to the silent scrutiny, smiled warmly at me and said, "Mom, pick whatever you like, really." I smiled softly, nodding, letting them believe I was a simple, slightly overwhelmed woman, unsure of what to order. Yet every small gesture, how I held the menu, the way I responded to Ethan's questions about my hobbies, the careful way I sipped my water, was calculated, subtle. I allowed the impression of humility to settle over the table, and I could almost hear their internal whispers, the judgments they weren't brave enough to speak aloud. Vivian leaned slightly forward, her voice a little too polite, a little too clipped. "You work, of course?" she asked, eyes flicking toward me, expecting a modest answer, perhaps a simple office job. I hesitated just long enough to let the silence linger, then said softly, "Yes, I do. I've always enjoyed the structure of my work. The responsibility." She tilted her head, curious, uncertain. Ethan's brow furrowed slightly. Was it confusion, or was he beginning to sense there was more beneath the surface? I couldn't tell, and I let the question hang in the air. I could feel Marcus glancing at me, proud and unaware that his mother was quietly holding the room in her hands. Conversation drifted from casual topics to the expected small talk about travel, hobbies, and weekend plans. I laughed gently at anecdotes Marcus shared, nodded encouragingly at Lena's contributions, and subtly guided the conversation when assumptions began to edge toward condescension. Every gesture, every word, was a measured reveal of poise and quiet confidence. I was testing them, gently, letting them believe they were the ones in control, while I held the truth beneath my calm exterior. And through it all, I watched Marcus. He smiled occasionally, squeezing my hand under the table, completely unaware that the mother he thought he knew ordinary, simple, unnoticed, was in fact someone who had quietly commanded power, respect, and success for decades. That night, I realized the table was no longer just a place for dinner. It was a stage, and I was about to teach a lesson they would never forget. The conversation at dinner shifted, as if someone had gently nudged it toward subtle examination. Lena's parents asked questions, polite but loaded, each one a test I was expected to fail. "Margaret, what do you do for work these days?" Vivian asked, her voice soft, yet carrying that unmistakable undercurrent of judgment. I smiled faintly, letting the silence stretch just a fraction longer than comfortable. "I manage a small team at my office," I said softly, careful, watching their reactions. Ethan's brow arched slightly. Vivian's lips pressed together in what might have been approval or maybe skepticism. The words themselves were ordinary, but the weight behind them was anything but. I could feel the subtle shift, a tiny tremor in the quiet balance of the evening. Lena, ever attentive, added, "It must be interesting, working with a team, managing people, meetings, deadlines." Her tone was polite, yet I sensed the assumption lurking beneath it that my life was routine, simple, nothing remarkable. I nodded, smiling with calm assurance, letting her think she understood me. As the appetizers arrived, the smell of roasted vegetables and fresh bread filled the table. I took my fork slowly, chewing deliberately, letting the meal itself be part of the conversation. "I enjoy problem solving," I said quietly, letting the words land softly but firmly. "Even when the challenges are unexpected, it's satisfying to see a solution come together." Vivian tilted her head, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "That's commendable," she said carefully, as if trying to find the right words. Ethan's smile became tighter, measured, and Lena's eyes widened, just slightly tiny cracks in their carefully maintained composure. I caught Marcus watching me, completely unaware of the subtle currents I was steering. He laughed at one of Lena's jokes, oblivious, as I responded to questions with grace, confidence, and quiet wit. Every word, every gesture was intentional. I wasn't revealing everything, not yet, but I was planting seeds. They wouldn't notice immediately, but by the end of the evening they would begin to sense the truth. And all the while I felt a quiet satisfaction building inside me, not from superiority, not from malice, but from a deep, serene awareness of my own strength. For years I had carried this life quietly, unseen, undervalued by my own son. But here, at this polished table, in this quiet restaurant, I could let the first whispers of reality slip through without saying a single boastful word. By the time the main course arrived, the subtle tension was tangible. They were testing me. I was responding not with anger or pride, but with calm dignity. Every polite smile, every measured pause, every gentle laugh was a reminder that appearances are never the whole truth. And I could feel, deep down, that tonight the story would unfold in ways they never expected. As the evening went on, I found myself reflecting quietly beneath the polite conversation and subtle judgments. No one at this table truly knew me. Not my son, not Lena, not her parents. To them, I was the simple, hard-working mother who had spent decades quietly supporting her family. They didn't know that behind the calm exterior, I had built a life of independence and accomplishment that would have astonished them if I had ever revealed it. I remembered long days in towering offices, the hum of fluorescent lights above, papers spread across polished desks, and the quiet satisfaction of decisions made well, contracts signed, strategies implemented. I had earned every dollar of that $40,000 monthly salary through discipline, vision, and years of relentless work, yet I had never flaunted it, not to my son, not to anyone. Pride wasn't in display. It was in quiet mastery, in knowing your own worth without needing anyone's validation. Lena's family was polite, yes, but they operated from assumptions. They assumed wealth and success had a certain look, a certain manner, a certain pedigree, and here I was, modest in appearance, calm in demeanor, seemingly unremarkable, and yet carrying a lifetime of achievement hidden beneath a simple coat and a gentle smile. I spoke gently about mundane topics, the garden I tended on weekends, the novels I enjoyed, the walks I took along Salem's cobblestone streets. Each word was carefully chosen to reinforce the image they expected. And yet, every phrase contained a subtle truth, a quiet assertion of knowledge, taste, and experience they hadn't anticipated. In the way I described a vineyard I'd visited, or the historical exhibit I'd studied, I left breadcrumbs they couldn't immediately interpret. Marcus laughed at a joke, oblivious, and I touched his hand under the table. A silent reassurance. I loved him dearly, but I also relished this rare moment of quiet revelation. For years I had let him see me as ordinary, and he had never questioned it. Tonight, that perception would slowly, subtly begin to shift. Every small gesture, how I held my fork, the calm of my voice, the clarity in my thoughts, was a quiet statement of who I really was. I didn't need to boast. I didn't need to prove myself with grand declarations. The strength was in the patience, in the subtle unfolding, in letting the truth make its way into their minds without force. And as I looked around the table, watching Lena's polite smiles falter, ever so slightly, and Vivian's carefully measured glances become uncertain, I felt a calm satisfaction settle deep within me. This wasn't about anger. It wasn't about proving superiority. It was about finally revealing, gently, that I had always been more than they, or even my own son had imagined. As the evening stretched on, I allowed myself to weave small, almost accidental hints into conversation. Nothing overt, nothing boastful, just delicate threads that revealed the woman I truly was. When Ethan commented on a new investment his company was pursuing, I offered a quiet observation, a thought about market trends and strategy that made him pause for a heartbeat. His eyes flickered with surprise, just enough to betray that my knowledge was unexpected. Vivian tried to steer the conversation back to more conventional topics, asking about cooking and family routines. I smiled softly and shared a detail about a recent dinner I had hosted for colleagues, a simple story, yet layered with subtle hints. The care in selecting ingredients, the precision in timing, the attention to ambiance. Lena's eyes widened for a brief moment, as if she recognized a sophistication she hadn't anticipated. Marcus remained blissfully unaware, sipping his drink and chatting casually, completely missing the tiny earthquakes happening around him. That was part of the charm. He had always thought of me as ordinary. Tonight, I was slowly unraveling that notion, one quiet clue at a time. I could sense the subtle shifts across the table, the tilt of a head, the narrowing of eyes, the small pause before replying. Lena's parents were beginning to question their assumptions without knowing why. I let them stew in that uncertainty, smiling gently, nodding politely, making no attempt to rush the revelation. Even Lena, who prided herself on perception and social finesse, seemed slightly unsettled, She leaned forward in her chair, asking questions that were meant to corner me, to expose simplicity, but she couldn't. I answered with calm confidence, allowing my words to carry subtle strength, not arrogance, not superiority, just a quiet truth that needed no proclamation. The main course arrived, rich aromas filling the air, yet the real flavor of the evening was tension soft, understated and intoxicating. I observed how every movement, every word was being measured against the image of me they had constructed. I felt a gentle thrill knowing that by the end of the night, their perception would be irreversibly shifted. And through it all, I reminded myself of the reason I had chosen this path: not to humiliate, not to shame, but to quietly assert the dignity, experience, and accomplishment I had earned over decades. This was my life, my truth, and for too long it had been invisible to the people who mattered most. Tonight, it would begin to be seen, gently, almost imperceptibly, until the full weight of it finally sank in. By the time dessert was served, I knew the tiny seeds had been planted. Their polite smiles had begun to falter. Their certainty had begun to crack. And I, sitting there calmly, smiling quietly, was beginning to savor the quiet power of being finally understood, not through anger, but through subtle, patient revelation. By the time the coffee cups arrived, the mood at the table had shifted in ways no one openly acknowledged. Lena's parents had begun to notice the inconsistencies in their assumptions, the tiny glimpses of sophistication that didn't match the ordinary mother image they had conjured. I let the realization hang in the air, unspoken, like a soft echo in a quiet room. I sipped my coffee slowly, deliberately, letting the rich aroma fill my senses, and smiled softly. Every gesture I made was measured, not hurried, not theatrical, just precise and calm. Ethan leaned forward slightly, probing, testing the waters. "Margaret, you must have quite a handle on finances then, with all your work," he asked, his voice polite but cautious. I nodded gently, taking a moment before responding. "I've always believed that understanding your resources and the people you work with is the key to any project," I said softly, letting the words carry quiet authority. The subtle shift in their expressions was enough for me. Surprise, curiosity, unease. They hadn't anticipated this, and I let it linger. Lena's smile faltered, just slightly, as she glanced between her parents and me. I knew she was beginning to realize that she had underestimated the woman sitting across from her. I spoke with calm confidence about simple topics: our neighborhood, the local library, a charity I had supported. But each sentence carried a quiet weight, a hint that I was not the woman they had expected. Marcus remained blissfully unaware, chatting about his work and laughing at a joke Lena made. His presence was a warm anchor, reminding me why I had chosen this path: not cruelty, not vindication, but the quiet assertion of dignity, the gentle unveiling of truth. With every careful word, every subtle revelation, I could feel the balance of the evening tipping. Their polite scrutiny began to waver. Vivian's lips pressed together, her carefully maintained composure slipping ever so slightly. Ethan's eyes lingered on me longer than necessary, as if trying to piece together the reality that didn't match his expectations. And I realized then that this was the power I had carried silently all these years, the power of patience, of restraint, of knowing your own worth and letting the world gradually see it. I didn't need to boast. I didn't need to declare myself. I simply existed fully in my truth, letting their assumptions crumble naturally, like a soft wind scattering leaves across a quiet street. By the time we rose from the table, the tension had not fully resolved, but the first wave of understanding had begun. Lena and her parents would leave that night questioning what they thought they knew, and I would leave with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes silence and subtlety speak louder than any confrontation ever could. The ride home was quiet. A comfortable silence filled only by Marcus humming softly to himself. But in my mind the evening played over again, frame by frame. Every glance, every polite smile, every subtle flicker of doubt on Lena's parents' faces. It was all there. They were beginning to sense it. They were beginning to see me, not as the mother Marcus had painted, not as the simple woman they expected, but as someone far more capable, far more formidable than appearances allowed. Back at home, I poured myself a cup of tea, the steam rising gently, curling in lazy circles. I reflected on the careful choreography of the evening, the balance of humility and authority, the patience, the restraint. Every word had been measured, every gesture intentional, and through it all, Marcus had remained blissfully unaware. Just as I had intended, I could almost hear the whispers of realization beginning in Lena's mind, the small cracks of uncertainty spreading among her parents. They hadn't yet pieced it together fully, but the seeds were planted, and the quiet thrill of knowing they were beginning to question their assumptions filled me with a deep satisfaction. Not malice, not vengeance, but justice in the form of awareness. I thought about the years I had kept this secret from my son. The simplicity he believed in, the ordinary life he imagined I led, it had been my choice to shield him from the complexity, the wealth, the independence I had quietly amassed. I had never wanted to overshadow him, never wanted to seem distant or intimidating. But now, seeing how assumptions can twist perception, I understood the subtle power of revealing the truth slowly, deliberately, when the moment was right. I thought of the quiet victories, the soft recognition that I had outgrown the limitations others imposed on me. That evening, the small smiles, the tiny hesitations, the subtle glances, they were all proof. Proof that I was no longer invisible, no longer underestimated. And that realization, that understanding, was far sweeter than any dramatic confrontation could have been. By the time I went to bed, I felt a calm satisfaction settling over me. Marcus would continue to see me as his mother, and yet, slowly, over time, he too would begin to notice the depth, the strength, the dignity I had carried all along. Lena and her parents would wrestle with their own perceptions, finally recognizing that the woman they had misjudged was not only extraordinary, but quietly untouchable in her composure and grace. And in that quiet, reflective moment, I understood something essential. Sometimes the most powerful lessons are taught not with words, but through presence, patience, and the serene confidence of knowing your worth. Tonight had been a beginning, and the rest I realized would unfold naturally. In its own time the next evening, I received a message from Lena. A polite thank you for dinner, a few words of appreciation for my company. And yet the tone carried hesitation, a subtle undercurrent I could sense immediately. She was thinking, reflecting, trying to reconcile the quiet strength she had glimpsed with the image she had constructed of me. I didn't reply immediately. I let it linger. Silence, after all, often speaks louder than any words. And in the days that followed, small things began to unfold. Ethan casually mentioned a conversation he had had with a colleague, comparing notes on leadership and strategy as if testing a theory. Vivian asked Lena a question about investments that carried an unfamiliar curiosity. And Marcus, ever perceptive in his own way, began noticing little things, my choices, my insight, my calm when a situation required thought and precision. It was a quiet revelation for them all, a soft unveiling that carried weight without drama. No harsh words, no confrontation. Just understanding, slowly emerging, like sunlight through a foggy morning. I watched it happen, and I felt a deep, serene satisfaction. The lesson had been delivered, not in anger, not in accusation, but through the undeniable truth of who I was. One evening, Marcus came to my room with a smile, sitting beside me as I sipped my tea. "Mom," he said softly, "I think I've underestimated you." I smiled, brushing his hand with mine. "Sometimes it takes time to see the whole picture," I whispered, and that, in a quiet way, was my poetic revenge. To let them discover the truth on their own, to gently shatter assumptions and leave a lasting impression that could not be ignored. I thought about the life I had lived, The choices I had made, the quiet independence I had maintained, the patience I had cultivated, all of it had led to this moment. A moment of understanding and recognition, achieved without confrontation or conflict. It was elegant, calm, and satisfying in ways that anger or loud triumph never could be. As I look back now, I realize that sometimes the most powerful victories are subtle. They unfold quietly, teaching lessons without a raised voice, revealing strength without the need for display. And perhaps that is the greatest gift a mother can give. Not wealth, not status, but the quiet demonstration of dignity, wisdom, and self-respect. Thank you for listening to my story. Sometimes, silence teaches more than words. Don't forget to subscribe and share your own story in the comments. Maybe your voice will be next on Her Voice.